Hi, my name is Nikki. This is the Interventionalist. And today I want to talk about the use of empathy as a coping mechanism in and out of an abusive relationship or abusive situation, particularly through things like intellectualization, cognitive versus affective empathy, and then also like cognitive dissonance. And I think that empathy can genuinely be like a survival tactic in a lot of different ways, both when you're in an abusive relationship and when you are out of it. And the reason that I want to talk about this is because a couple of videos ago, I posted about how I was in an abusive relationship and the woman I was in the relationship with was incredibly misogynistic. In the way that I realized that the development of her as a person was obviously influenced by misogyny, being raised in a misogynistic world, the influence of things that are out of our control. And sometimes I struggle with thinking about that, or I really try to avoid thinking about that perspective, particularly because it leads to me like inherently empathizing with her. And I think that can just be a dangerous path to go down for any victim. And I got a few comments of people saying how they were really helpful comments and good reminders too, but like I think you can recognize maybe like somewhat of the cause, like what led to a person to become who they were, but it doesn't erase the accountability of their actions. And I think that's totally true. I think that abusing somebody is not a coping mechanism for having been abused, but I do think using empathy, particularly cognitive empathy and rationalization, is a coping mechanism. And I think that's true, right? Like we can look at the things that affected them, but it doesn't change the effect that they've now had on other people, which is being cruel and abusive. But I think the thing that's difficult is like no matter how much you know that, the problem is when you're in an abusive relationship, like so much of your survival, I think relies on empathy in so many different ways. Like, and I'll talk about more, but one of the ways is like needing to be attuned to the person that you're with as a way to protect yourself if they're a dangerous individual, which relies on like empathy and understanding them both in like a cognitive way. So like cognitive empathy is understanding something versus affective, which is like feeling. And that's a way to feel close to somebody, to understand them better. The more you're connected to them, the more that you understand them. I think that's one way that we really rely on empathy. And there's all these different which I'm like going to talk about, but all these different ways that I think empathy is so central to the experience of being in an abusive relationship, and also to like experiencing a trauma bond and how difficult that can be to just like suddenly that empathy just disappears once you're out of it. So even if you like cognitively, you intellectually understand that is true, it's sort of like it's hardwired into your body to empathize with this person, to understand them, to excuse in some capacity or another, because that's often what you have to do when you're in a situation that you can't get out of. That's an abusive situation or one that you've really been manipulated or gaslit in. And that's like what happens to your head. It gets like rewired, reprogrammed to find a way to understand this person and particularly understand them in a way that makes it bearable. And the way that you can make an abusive situation feel bearable is by making it not so bad. And so you can only make it not so bad if it has a reason. And then the bad person and the bad things that they're doing isn't so bad, right? Because like, oh, well, there's a reason. So maybe one day all of this bad that's happening because there's a reason behind it will bleed out and it'll all go away. Like it'll be done. You kind of always hope that somehow like it'll fade out. Like you'll get past this point, right? You never do. It only gets worse. It only escalates. But if you put the focus on something else, it takes away from the reality of how bad the situation actually is and the person is and what they're doing. So it's helpful. It's like a survival tactic. Anyways, I'm getting off topic because I got a few comments on that video of people being like, oh, this would be interesting to talk about. And I wanted to make a video on it because I do think this is a really interesting topic and I've struggled with this. Like I talked about in that video, I struggle with it. Or I have struggled with it. And so when I went in to try and film this video, I did like a little bit of research on things that I wanted to talk about, and I still will in this video, like particularly research on cognitive dissonance. And I don't know, I went into it thinking, okay, all of these things that I want to talk about, my thoughts on this, mean something to me. Like they mean something to me, and at one point in my life, they felt so big and they felt so huge and painful. And then I was like researching for it, and I'm expecting it to be in past tense. Like I'm expecting to be able to talk about the pain and the influence of these things in past tense. Because I'm like, oh, I've struggled with this. And then I like sat down to try and film it on Wednesday, and it's Friday. And I think I'll probably upload this today as well. But I tried to film this already on Wednesday, or on Tuesday. I tried to film it on Tuesday, and I spent hours, like hours trying to film this video. And no matter what I did, like I couldn't, like it didn't feel right. No matter what I did, I couldn't get it right. And it wasn't that I wasn't saying things that I didn't mean, because I meant everything that I was saying, and there are things I'll say now in this version that hopefully I can get through. I meant everything that I was saying, and I had done research, and I understood more, and now I understood from like slightly an academic perspective, right? And then I go to sit down and try and talk about it, and it felt like I was regurgitating like points and information, even when I was saying things that were personal to me. It felt like I was just like regurgitating, like word vomiting these ideas, but they felt like nothing. Like they felt empty. It felt hollow. And that was really confusing to me, because when I talk about things like this, like often, even if it is in past tense, I can feel it. I feel it. I know that sounds like kind of maybe like stupid or a little bit silly, but when I talk about things, especially things that I've hurt in the past, like words feel very like tangible, like you can feel them, like you can still feel the weight of them or the shape of them, like just from memory alone, from having once been so consumed by them, these ideas. And I felt nothing. And so I tried for hours, and I would get up and I'd be like, oh my God, like I don't understand what is going on. And then I started to like, I started to get that very familiar sensation where everything inside of you starts to feel like very fuzzy, and it kind of feels like you're looking, like your vision is like through a cloud of smoke, but it's not, like it's clear. But when you try and remember, like looking back, it quite literally looks like your memory is as if you were standing like in a cloud of smoke and everything around you was blurry and fuzzy. And when you're in the moment like that, it's just very particular feeling, and you feel so disconnected, like you can't get a grip on anything around you. And then that slowly started to slip in by the last like few times I tried to film it, into that like very familiar tension of, I felt like I was about to like like that tension where you know that you're on the verge of sort of like breaking into fragments, like you're about to lose your grip on yourself, like it's gonna come out of you, like whatever it is that is you is about to be ripped out of you, pulled out of you without your consent. And it's like you're gonna see yourself in front of you and not be able to touch it. And that's just such a bizarre feeling, and also a really unsettling feeling, because it's like you're watching yourself exist, and yet it's like you're behind it, like you are now existing in front of yourself, and you're behind this like glass mirror that's still kind of fuzzy, but suddenly you feel no connection, and it's just really uncomfortable and kind of scary. And I started to feel that, and then I realized that that's why I didn't feel connected to anything that I was saying, because I was disassociating, or I was on the verge of like going into a really bad dissociative episode, or I guess maybe I was at that point. And so I stopped. I was like, okay, it's almost midnight. I have to give up. I've been doing this for hours. I have to give up. And then I started to panic, because for me, like the thing that always follows like having like a dissociative episode like that is a PTSD episode. And I haven't had a PTSD episode in almost a year, since like last May. And then I realized, okay, like shit, like fuck, maybe this topic is harder than I thought to talk about, or maybe I'm more affected by it than I realized, and maybe this is more of a present issue for me than I realized. I don't know. And so then I panicked, and I went into the shower, and I did what I always try and do like before or during a PTSD episode, which is I try and like mess with temperature. So I like stood in the shower, I made it really hot, and then really cold, and really hot, and then eventually just stood in there for like 30 minutes with it like really hot, and just felt myself like disassociating and trying really hard not to, because PTSD episodes are really scary, like just to be transparent, and I haven't had one in almost a year, and the last time I was having them, they got really bad. And so the thought of going into one, like in the middle of the night and I'm like alone, started to actually really scare me. And so I started kind of panicking, and then I was like, I have to calm down or it's actually going to happen. And then I kind of like got a grip on it. Like I don't know, I felt like I could get out, and I don't know. I was like, I felt like I got a little bit of a grip after standing in the shower for maybe like 30 minutes in like scalding hot water. And so I stood up and I got out of the shower and I looked in the mirror, like trying to see if I recognized myself, like the very common dissociation, whatever, idea. And then I felt like I looked like, I don't know, like some limited edition version of a fucking wet Muppet. And I was like, okay, that's disappointing. And then I went and like laid in my bed, and then I just like lost it. And actually, that's not true. Like, it doesn't take a lot for me to cry. But like I just started sobbing, and I didn't really understand why. And then I just like sat and I thought, and I realized I was like, oh my God, okay, so like why is this concept of like empathizing so difficult for me? Like all I'm talking about is the idea of like understanding why she did the things she did, or understanding what might have contributed to her as a person. Like, why is this freaking me out? Like, I've thought about this so many times. Like, and then I realized like I haven't thought about her as a real person in a really long time. Probably not since I was having those major PTSD episodes. Like this time last year, I was in treatment for it. I did take a medical leave off work because I was like not well. Like I was worried that I was gonna like slip into like psychosis, honestly. And I haven't thought about her like as a real person. I think I've really conceptualized her, and I can talk about her sometimes and it's fine, but I can talk about her as a concept, as an example. Like when I'm talking about misogyny, I can use her as an example for a greater concept. She's just an idea that lives within an idea, right? Like I've conceptualized her, and I haven't thought of her as like a human. She is not just an example of a concept. Like she's the personification of these things that I'm talking about that relate to these concepts. Like she's the personification of these concepts that I talk about that are often pretty horrible. She's real, like she's a real person. And it just made me, who knows like why I really lost it, but I think that it had a lot to do with the fact that I haven't thought about her as a real person. And when I started researching this, I was really looking at it from the angle of cognitive empathy, like understanding her, but then I started to think about like affective empathy and like what led to the bond that we even originally had. And there's no denying that began with affective empathy, like feeling for her, right? Like when she would tell me something that hurt her or she was sad, like it made my heart hurt, right? That like ache inside of you for this person because you care about them, and the thought of them in pain crushes you. And I don't feel that way about her anymore. Like I don't feel affective empathy for her in any capacity. I feel cognitive, but I think the reminder of what I once felt for her, that affective empathy that was rooted in the fact that she was a real person that I watched exist and, I don't know, be in pain or not be in pain. Who knows if she was ever actually like in pain. She was a pretty damn, I don't know if anything she ever told me was actually true, to be honest. And the remembrance of that did something that I just didn't realize I was doing, which was I had to confront my intellectualized memory of her with my lived experience for the first time in a long time. But the problem is that I didn't realize that I had done that because I'm reading like, these articles, these journal articles on intellectualization and cognitive dissonance and all these things, and I'm talking about it in past tense, and then reading about them and thinking about her and thinking about the different ways I have once empathized with her. It like hit me that I have turned her into a concept. I've like fully intellectualized her, at least recently. And I think just that recognition alone, like thinking about the way I once truly did empathize with her beyond just understanding, broke that distance. Because intellectualization is a form, it's a coping mechanism as a way to distance yourself from your emotions, right? Like it's a way to avoid having to feel things. So you intellectualize them and you understand them and you analyze them, and you can trick yourself into thinking that you've processed them because you've come to understand them, but that won't get rid of like that deep affected part of you that remains like emotionally affected, and you're still impacted by that emotional effect, whether or not you want to acknowledge it or not. Like, it'll come out eventually, like it just did to me. Because you can run from yourself forever, maybe not forever, but you can run from yourself, and you always run back into yourself. And that's what I did. Like, I ran back into myself trying to film this, and I ran back into myself when I was 22 and in that relationship. And intellectualization, like, will make you feel like you're safe and you can create distance. And the thing is, like, the creation of that distance can make you feel like you've created now two separate realities. One that is okay, one that makes sense, and then one that was. And in the one that makes sense, the one that you've intellectualized, particularly through cognitive empathy, that's like why I've thought a lot about that. The one that you've intellectualized makes sense, and so it feels safe. But the one that was real most likely doesn't actually make that much sense, like, to your body, to the part of you that's just human and hurts, to your nervous system trying to, like, re-regulate. Like, being abused is never supposed to make sense to you, and it's never really going to make sense. And you can intellectualize it, and eventually I think they can combine in, like, a healthy way, right? But, like, when you live deeply just in one, you don't ever, like, you can't fully process or heal because you'll be consumed by it. And in different ways, I think that can really hurt you. And I think I was just I was like consumed by the intellectualization, and I've created this reality where things make sense and they don't make sense. Like, when I actually think about what happened, when I had to think about what happened and who she was, and the things that I cognitively came up with or attached to her as a way to make sense of the things that she did, that was where I was living. That was the reality I created. That's the one I lived in. That's where things made sense. But experiencing it didn't make any sense. It just hurt. And I think when you're existing kind of purely in that intellectual bubble, that, like, cognitive bubble, that, like, sort of founded in cognitive empathy bubble, where you're, like, sort of convincing yourself you don't hate this person because you can kind of understand it, and no, you're not excusing what they did, but you can kind of understand it. So, like, you extend some, like, empathy. It's not just, like, pure intellectualization. Like, you're trying to humanize them in, like, an understanding way, but you're also kind of trying to dehumanize them to yourself, as a way to sort of, for the sake of your sanity, you can forget what things felt like. And then, like, I think what happened when I was thinking about this is, you know, I had to think about my lived experience and why I found the particular reasonings that I did, and it burst that bubble. Like, I had to go outside of that safe zone that I created, like, where things were purely intellectual, and I had to look inside what was once just, like, really effective, like the effective empathy aspect, where things just felt and things just hurt. And I felt for her, and how confusing when you feel for someone and they feel so hateful towards you, and you just, it doesn't make any sense. And so that bubble burst like, probably early in the day, probably when I was reading about things and I just didn't realize it. That bubble burst, and then I was thinking about reality, and then I was like, oh, that actually is really terrible, and that will never make sense to me, and maybe I'm never supposed to make sense of it. And yes, I can conceptualize her, and yes, I can use her as an example to make a concept come to life, but the fact that she is real and she has come to life and she's human, I don't know if I say it doesn't make sense to me, but it doesn't, or at least it's something that is really hard for me to genuinely accept or live with. But no matter how hard that is for me to live with or accept, it doesn't change the fact that it's true. And the reality is that she does exist and I exist, and we once existed together, and we both continue to exist in that reality, just in different times of it now. But the reality that I've created to protect myself based in, like, intellectualization and cognitive empathy, there's truth to it, but it's not the only reality that exists. And it kind of means nothing if it completely denies or ignores the reality of really what was, which was the fact that these were two real people, and I was one of them. And that is then what led me into thinking about cognitive dissonance. And, like, when I was thinking about cognitive dissonance, so I did some research on it, just, like, to have some, like, general, like, a really general foundation of what it is, because I'm thinking about it in different ways than necessarily how I think it's generally thought of. But here's like one research article I read. It's called The Importance of Cognitive Dissonance in Understanding and Treating Victims of Intimate Partner Violence. And it's defined as cognitive dissonance is most often defined as a situation in which two attitudes or an attitude and behavior conflict, causing feelings of uneasiness and immorality. And I think what happened when the bubble burst and I lived in this intellectualized world, the nice thing about this intellectualized world is that I can erase myself, okay? Like, I think that empathy, a lot of times in this case, if you're struggling with empathizing with the person who has abused you, I think it can be a survival tactic within it. And I also think when you get out of it, it can be a coping mechanism in different ways. But one of the ways that I think it can help you cope is by erasing yourself from the narrative. Like, empathy is a form of self-erasure. Because if I solely focus on understanding this person, I don't have to think about myself. And that self-erasure can feel like salvation when you're currently in the heart of something that still feels too painful to exist in. And I was thinking about cognitive dissonance because that bubble bursted, right? And then I had to reconcile not only like the people that now exist in my intellectualized idea of what happened and understanding, but I have to reconcile something that I haven't in a long time, which is the concepts of both her and I and who we actually were. And that's hard because when you're in an abusive relationship, why cognitive dissonance I think is so important to talk about is that things don't make sense about yourself to you. And it's hard to look at yourself in the mirror or like understand yourself when you look back and you knew, right? Like, you can genuinely know that something's wrong, that this isn't right, that what they're doing is bad. But abuse doesn't work in like a simple way. It's not like a simple, okay, well, this is bad, I'm out. Like, once you're in that position, usually, when you find out that things are this bad and they are abusive, you're already in this like state of mind that you're most likely completely disoriented. They most likely have a major grasp on your concept of reality, because when somebody breaks you down so significantly and constantly traumatizes you, which dysregulates you and causes you to feel scattered all over the place, they then have a lot of power in the way that they choose to sort of orient you again, right? Like, that's like, I think one of the strongest aspects of a trauma bond is they hurt you the worst so badly, and then they're the only one there to comfort you and also tell you things like, you're being dramatic, it's fine. And that feels good when things are too painful to be real. And so it's like, if I'm being dramatic, then they're not real and it's not this bad and maybe it's not this painful, but the pain doesn't go away. And they have this power when they've disoriented you that much to reorient you in whatever way that they want. And so they build the reality for you. And so even though you know something's off and you know something's wrong and you know they shouldn't be hurting you this way, they've built this weird warped reality that you're now in. And suddenly, just because things are like really bad, maybe they're not as bad, or you're not allowed to think that they're as bad as they are because you're being dramatic. So like, yes, maybe they're bad, but like, I'm being dramatic. They're not bad enough to be called abusive. They're not bad enough for me to be a victim. And like, that's what you tell yourself. And you're already in like a state of mind where the idea of, okay, well, I realize it's bad, I'm going to leave. That's like really not, your brain doesn't usually work in that way anymore. At least not for probably a while. And while you still might have a bit of a cognitive grip, like that understanding that something's wrong, which I did, I would write about it, that I know this is bad, I know this is toxic, but like, it's just people don't understand, or it's maybe it'll get better, like all these things. So you have a cognitive grip that's like not really fully gone away. And yet, because your concepts of reality, like your whole body is all like fucked up, you don't behave in accordance with that. You stay, right? Like, even though if someone came to you, like a close friend, and told you that they were experiencing what you are, you would most likely immediately, without doubt, be like, you need to leave, like this is unsafe, right? But you're not leaving. And no matter how much of a really like a cognitive grip you have at that point, no matter what's been happening, deep down you usually know like, this isn't okay, I shouldn't be in so much pain. And so you have this dissonance, which just means like this disharmony. They're not aligning, and that can lead to so much guilt and shame and self-blame, because if you knew, why didn't you behave differently? And there's so many ways that you can convince yourself that you should have behaved differently without giving yourself like the recognition of you can't always behave in the ways that usually you can't behave in the ways that you want in an abusive relationship because it's not safe. And it only takes a couple times to become aware of that unsafety to like your body to shut down and not like sort of go into like a freeze response, because now you know that somebody is really capable of harming you. It's like, why would you put yourself in a position when you know that they're really capable of harming you, of where they might choose to harm you more, like trying to leave? Like, it's not that easy. And so you can hate yourself for it, and you can be someone that you don't want to be, and it's just, that dissonance is really hard to reconcile with in the moment. And then it's really difficult to reconcile with when you're hopefully outside of it and you're free. And then you have to reconcile with who you were and try not to blame yourself for who you weren't. And for me, like, that's really difficult to be quite frank, to not like hate myself for it. I have done a lot of, I think, work. I've gone to therapy every week since I've gotten out of the relationship. I'd go to therapy when I was in it. I would lie to my therapist every day or every week. But I've done a lot of work to not blame myself. And I don't think like on a cognitive level, right? Like an intellectual level, I do. I understand the situation that I was in, and I understand the circumstances, and I understand now through the abundance of research, and also just the way that I view the world, and that this is not an easy thing to navigate, and things like experiencing cognitive dissonance and this disharmony between what you know and what you do and who you are, and then suddenly who you aren't. That's all incredibly common. Like, this is not uncommon, and I know that intellectually, and I can sort of like cognitively empathize with myself, but I think it comes back to the concept of like effective empathy. Like, I don't feel that way. The same way that I don't feel for her anymore. My heart doesn't break when I think about her potentially having been hurt in the past. I can like understand on a cognitive level, and I can extend like some empathy to that. Like, I know why you're hurting on like a cognitive level. I feel for your pain, and I'm sorry that you're in pain. Like, I could say that to myself, but I don't actually feel like it's true. Like, I am not at fault or a major failure, or I need to work really hard to rectify the way that I failed myself in that situation, and failed at everything that I believed in. And I don't know, like, it's hard for me to feel that way. It's like a very deeply ingrained sort of repulsion to that idea. Like, I sort of, what's the word? I don't know. Like, it bounces off of me. Like, I can think about it all I want, and I can say it out loud all I want, and I'm sure one day I will believe it. I'm sure I will. But I don't feel that way right now. And so when that bubble burst and I thought about like the intellectualization, I had to think about the effective empathy I once felt for her, the lived experience. My bubble burst that created the distance that I needed. I'm now like living in that moment, and not only do I have to look at her as a real person again, I have to look at myself, and I don't like that. That is hard for me to do without just feeling like, I don't know, having to like recognize that was a real reality that will never not be real, like what happened. And I was someone that I never thought that I would be, and I just have to reconcile that. I don't know, and that's just hard because I don't like it. I don't like that that's a reality. I don't like that it's true, and I think part of it has to do with, I mean, who knows if this actually really changed things long term, but I did get like the very common fucked up responses a couple times after I got out from people being like, why didn't you leave? But one that really stuck with me, and I think I've really internalized, I saw a friend, this guy that I was friends with, like right after I got out, and I had to move states. Like, I got out, and I like had to be out of the state. Like, I had to go. Like, there was no way I could stay where I was and stay safe. And I drove to a city, like in another state, and I looked at apartments, and I literally signed a lease like on the spot. I've never been to the city in my life. I was there for like 10 minutes to go inside and leave, which I'm very, very beyond lucky and grateful that I was able to do this. And I did that, and then I got back to my apartment where I was living, and I packed all of my shit within literally like 24 hours. And then I had like 3 days until my flight left. And in that time, I was like, my ex-girlfriend was, obviously reaching out a bunch, and I was like trying to find a way to deflect. So I'd like convinced her, I was like texting her still, which sounds like counterintuitive, but I was texting her like, oh, I'm in California, like I'm not home, so that she wouldn't come to where I was, because if she did, I would have been fucked. And I'd like 3 days left. And so I asked if he wanted to get together, because I hadn't seen him in a long time, because when I got in that relationship, she hated everyone that I was friends with, and it was hell to try and keep these friends. She particularly hated him. I don't know why. Like, I'm literally gay and he had a girlfriend, but she hated everyone I was friends with. And you get to a point where, like, even though you know that they're isolating you, like I don't know, the reaction that you get for trying to fight that is so much worse than, it's just like not worth it anymore. Like the pain that will come from having to try and fight against that isolation just feels not worth it. And it gets to a point, I feel like, for me, where it was just too unsafe to do that. And so I reached out to him. I hadn't seen him in a long time, and I went and met up with him, and I kind of like was telling him what happened, like not really detailed, but I was like explaining the general gist and like what was happening. And I was telling him like, yeah, I'm moving now, like immediately. I'm gonna go back to my hometown in California for a while, and then move to this other state, whatever. And he looked at me. I'll never forget this. We were sitting in my car, and I just told him all this, and he looked at me and said, I'm just really disappointed in you. I'm not gonna lie. I'm just so disappointed. Like, why did you do this? I really admired you. Like, what? What? When I remember that, like, it's unreal to think that somebody said that. Like, in that moment though, I felt so guilty. Like, and it was true, because I disappointed myself. Like, I disappointed myself, and then everyone apparently around me was disappointed, because this isn't something that's gonna, like, another friend of mine who I don't really talk to anymore either, actually I haven't talked to in now like 2 years, she said to me, you of all people, I just didn't expect that. Like, thank you for now making me believe that, like, I was like a beyond failed version of myself, or like human in that moment. Just utterly failed. Disappointment, failed. Didn't matter like what had occurred or what hadn't occurred. No matter like how unsafe it was or how abusive it was, like I failed. And like those responses reiterated it in a way that actually, when I think about it, I probably did internalize a lot. There was so much going on back then that like I didn't think about the things that they said. Thinking about it for the first time right now in quite a long time. And like, thank you for reminding me of like that dissonance, like who I once was and who I know that I am, and then what I became. And that having to reconcile that and like not hate yourself is a feat. And it just takes time. And I know that I won't hate myself forever. And I don't think, if you're experiencing something like this too, and you experience that dissonance, like looking at who you were and like who you are and how the hell that could have ever happened, and you feel like you're gonna hate yourself forever, like I know that will not be the case. I know that will not last forever. That hatred or that pain, eventually it will fade out. It will not last forever. And I know that it won't last forever, even on my worst days, even though I ran back into myself the other night, because I've had good days. I've been so beyond lucky to have good days since then that I know it won't last forever. And that is enough to give me hope to know that even if in this moment, my body particularly feels like it won't last forever, cognitively, or my body feels like it's going to last forever, cognitively, I know that it won't. And I do have some evidence of that. And so there's like an aspect of empathy, these different kinds of extending empathy, or these different experiences of empathy that can be coping mechanisms, survival tactics, and cognitively empathizing with myself that way, being like, I understand why you feel that way. But this won't be the case, right? Like I extend myself that sort of empathy, and it sounds almost weird to think I extend myself empathy, but it really is a thing. Caring about yourself, like believing yourself, empathizing with yourself, and no longer trying to find a way to distance yourself completely from the pain of what happened or from the reality of what happened. I think that's the kind of empathy that you need to extend yourself, is like feel it. Like you need to effectively, like a form of effective empathy, like feel for yourself, like genuinely feel those emotions, and then provide that sort of intellectual understanding that will give you hope on a more analytical level. And that might be all that you have to grasp onto, is like pattern recognition on like an analytical level, an intellectual level, about like statistics, like people might feel this way for this amount of time and get past it. There's this many people that felt this way and they got past it. Like hold on to that sort of cognitive empathy for yourself, but you have to experience the effective empathy. But I guess, I don't know. I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts on this. I just didn't anticipate them to come out this way. I didn't anticipate to be hit in the face with like the impact of months and months, because I don't think I was intellectualizing this so much this time last year, but months and months of rationalization as a way to make things okay, you know, like rationalization and intellectualization, your cognitive empathy, I suppose, for the person, like rationalizing what they're doing, like extending that understanding, but rationally can sometimes be one of the only ways that you can find a way to survive within. Because when you can't get out of something, you have to find a way to survive within. And like, I think one of the most common ways to do that is through rationalizing their behavior and attributing their abuse to something greater. There's actually something that was talked about in that article that I already referenced, and it's about something called the salvation ethic. And this is what it says about it. The salvation ethic occurs when a victim views her husband as sick and dependent on her to recover. In this way, she is able to place the blame for the abuse not directly on her husband, but on his illness. So for me, for example, when I talk about the impact of systemic misogyny on my ex-girlfriend that made her hate women so much, somebody said in the comments, actually a couple mentioned how they can sometimes find it easier to forgive men than women. And I think that's very true, because we have like a go-to right away, which is men are socialized through misogyny to be quite violent. There's many different ways that can occur. I do think having a system, sort of a fallback on something objective, like the impact of a system like misogyny, can make it easier to excuse someone, especially when their behavior has been so normalized. Like you don't expect more from them, but you expect more from people who don't fall within that category. And anyways, that's just one way, right? Like the illness in this case, one of them was the misogyny on a system level that I attribute to her. And then it also says, rationalization allows victims to attribute the cause of their intimate partner violence to an outside source apart from their abuser, reducing dissonance caused by the discrepancy between the love they feel towards their partners and accepting that he is abusive. And I think that's just another example that like can exist within a relationship, where particularly like the dissonance that can exist between like effective empathy and reality, and your like cognitive knowing of things, your rationalization, or even like that like cognitive grip you have that still tells you that this is bad, is where you do care about them, whether it's like a trauma bond caused by once having genuinely felt care for them, or like it was just caused sort of right off the bat, like it began immediately abusive. You care for them, and you can care for them in a way that's very deep, that only a trauma bond can cause. And there is that dissonance of like having to find a way to explain it because you love this person and you care for them, and there's no way they can be this bad because you cannot keep loving somebody who is this bad to you. And so you still care for them, and you have to make it make sense. They cannot be this bad, at least not without reason. And so your effective empathy, your love for them, your care for them leads you, and also because you have to find a way to survive within, to make sense of it cognitively, and then you start to rationalize and you start to make sense of them, and then you start to apply cognitive empathy to them, like where it's just understanding. It's more than just feeling for them, like you need to understand them. And we always want to understand the people that we're with, but it's like you really need that in order to find a way to survive within, because at that point, like it's at the sake of your sanity. Rationalization like is what can feel like is keeping you, I don't know what the word is, like keeping you sane, at least keeping you in a world that makes some sense. Because once things start to make no sense, of course you start to feel insane. And eventually it usually gets to a point where nothing can make any sense. And then you do start to feel insane, and like, God forbid, it causes you to have a full breakdown. I was really afraid that would happen when I got out of it. I was so afraid that I was going to slip into like psychosis. I remember looking up like mental hospitals. I think I literally searched like psych wards because I didn't really know anything about that kind of stuff. I searched like psych wards near me, in the city near me, because I was genuinely afraid that I was going to like lose my grip on reality, my grip on my sanity. And the only reality I had at that point was the one that I built in my isolated relationship, that cognitive reality I built through trying to understand her because I cared about her, and also because at that point I couldn't get out. So I tried to understand her, built her reality, and then it shattered, thank God, because I got out. But then my entire reality shattered, and I had to enter back into one that would also force me to confront that this reality was only constructed as a way to protect myself and how bad it really was. And accepting that like dissonance and not hating yourself or losing your goddamn mind is really difficult. And so your reality shatters, and that's the only reality you have. And at some point, like, no matter how bad it is, like how horrific it is, you learn to navigate that reality. That's why, like, if you've suffered abuse in the past, it makes you often more vulnerable to being victimized again later, or like re-victimized, because you've made sense of an abusive reality. Like, it feels familiar. You know how to navigate it. It's almost more uncomfortable to navigate a reality where that's not the case anymore. And that's kind of what it feels like. And going back to the example about like finding it easier maybe to excuse men because we have like almost this immediate thing to fall back on, like the system. In that same article, there's something that I thought was interesting and spoke to that. And it says, one such model is the Duluth power and control wheel based on the feminist theory of batterer behavior. The existing and controversial theory behind the Duluth model is that given the extant gender roles in society, violence is simply a socialized response from men. So that's like an easy reality that you don't even really have to fall back on, but an easy one to use as a way to make sense of the abuse you might be facing if you're in a relationship with a man and the abuser is a man. That's like almost an immediate, easy fallback, like, of course, right? And in my case, like, I didn't have that so much, and I relied on other ways to try and like make a construct of reality. Like, there wasn't that immediate power imbalance or like socialization. I could just be like, oh, obviously she's like this. So I constructed it in different ways, understanding that it was like she hated women probably because she was abused or hated by men, and because she's traumatized, which I don't even know if is really true. She was like very much pathological liar. And yeah. I don't know. I guess that's maybe like kind of it. I don't know. Like, I didn't anticipate this to feel so present tense for me. I had no idea that I was in a bubble that was about to burst. I just like did not anticipate running back into myself. And it was really scary in the moment. And at the same time, I'm thankful that I thought about this, because obviously this is something that is affecting me and holding me back, because it's preventing me from processing things that obviously are still really painful. And I don't think it's bad, like, sometimes to give yourself that space, but there's only so long I can give myself that distance as a form of safety before I like never feel safe again, right? Like, because I'm never going to feel safe unless I feel safe internally. And until I like genuinely really process these emotions, and like hence no longer simply intellectualize them, I'll never feel safe, because I don't feel safe internally in any capacity. And because of that, I could be in the most secure room in the world and feel terrified all the time, like a fucking prey animal. And so I'm glad this bubble burst. I don't mind it. And it's okay that I ended up in the shower turning the water from hot to fucking cold to freezing, and then getting out and looking like a Muppet. Like, it's okay. In a weird way, I appreciate it, because I do know now, after going through this for years, that with each bad day or with each really bad moment, there's more time in between the good and the bad days. And that's why, like, something I used to try and like cope with when I was having really consistent, really bad PTSD episodes, I would tell myself, like, eventually they'll sort of run out. Like, one, having a PTSD episode is one step closer to not having any, because with each time something comes to light and a bubble bursts, you process it. And I needed to process this, and through this I'll process it more. I'll talk about it in therapy, and I'm thankful that I didn't spiral into PTSD episode. Like, that's a win for me. So I'm also thankful for that. And this was hard to think about, but I think it was really important to think about. Intellectualization can really save your ass when you're in a position where things are too painful to feel, and we have to exist in a world where, like, you don't have a choice but to keep existing. Like, the world does not slow down while you feel like you've fallen apart or you have fallen apart. The world doesn't slow down. You have to keep existing. And intellectualization can like allow you to do that and stay put together in a material way to stay safe, like work and like make an income to keep yourself like housed, things like that. And so intellectualization is an important thing, I think, to be able to have as a way to protect yourself. And I'm thankful for it, because if not, realistically, what I've been able to cope with, like randomly, literally within like 2 weeks, moving to another state, changing my phone number, and like having to restart my whole life. Like, no, I needed to be able to compartmentalize that way for a while. It's just, I no longer need to do that, you know? Like, I'm no longer in an unsafe house. My bedroom is no longer haunted. I live on a quiet street. Like, I'm okay, and I still feel terrified all of the time, and I'm always running, and I need to stop. So yeah, that's how I feel, I suppose. I need to stop erasing myself from the narrative and like face the facts, which is she existed and I existed in that, and that's okay. And I didn't exist as the person that I don't know, that made sense to me. And that's also okay. And maybe this will affect me for years to come, and I'll have bad days on and off for years to come. But honestly, like, I just feel grateful for the fact that I am in a position where I'm even alive to have good days. So that's enough for me. And if I do have to like live with the memory of this forever, like, and it will maybe always hurt when it comes up, and maybe it won't. I'm sure that it won't. That's okay, right? Like, I can find a way to live alongside it without it consuming me. And that's all I really know, or that's all I really need to know in order to not let this make me lose my mind the way that it might have a year ago. So that's a win. Yeah, I guess that's kind of it. If you're experiencing this, like you suffer from like severe intellectualization, or having to come to terms with what occurred when you were really experiencing deep cognitive dissonance, and you struggle with extending empathy to the person who hurt you rather than extending it to yourself in many different ways, but particularly like extending yourself effective empathy, like really feeling what happened to you. I just hope you know that you're not alone, and like if that bubble does burst, like it won't, that disorientation and that pain and that sort of like slap in the face of what has been, and knowing that that's always what it will be. That pain doesn't last forever, neither does that disorientation. And I think it's important to remember that even if right now you might be using empathy as a way to cope, and maybe erasing yourself from the narrative and focusing on the person who hurt you as a way to cope, I think at the very least, remember that your empathy truly is genuinely a gift. It is a gift to be able to care for others, to extend empathy in any capacity. It's a gift to be able to understand others. It's a wonderful thing to have in all different ways, cognitively, effectively. Empathy truly is a gift, and I hope that you can at least recognize that in yourself. And one day, even if it's not right now, you will extend that empathy to yourself. You will. Like, when you have that much empathy that you are capable of extending it to somebody that was so cruel, it will eventually overflow and into yourself. Like, absolutely 1,000%. Like, eventually it will come back to you, from you. And I think that's what's most important. Like, experiencing empathy from others after experiencing this is incredibly important. But empathizing with yourself and extending yourself genuine empathy, and not analyzing your victimhood, but feeling it, and allowing yourself to acknowledge what that means and what came with that, you'll eventually, I think, find yourself empathizing with yourself. And that's also a gift, right? There's so many ways that empathy can save us. It really is like a survival tactic. It's a coping mechanism. It's a way to make sense of the world, and it's a way to make sense of yourself. And I think it's just really important to not lose sight of that, like knowing that what you went through still couldn't steal that from you, still couldn't steal your empathy. And that truly is like a gift. It is through empathy that we can extend kindness and be a salvation to others and ourselves. Like, the fact that you could survive something like that and come out someone still soft, even though you might feel beyond hardened, or it makes you have no idea who you are anymore. Sometimes you worry that you're too soft and all these things. Like, to go through something so painful and come out with the strength that is softness in your empathy, you should cherish that, and you should be proud of yourself. And yeah, but to go through so much cruelty and to come out with kindness and understanding and empathy whether it's a coping mechanism or not, is genuinely still a gift, and your ability to be soft that way is a gift. And yeah, I just hope you don't forget that. And no one can ever take that from you. No one can ever steal that from you. So it's okay if right now maybe it's working against you a bit, because it is still a gift that you have, and eventually it will help heal you as well. Because you get to experience your own empathy eventually. And I know that'll happen, and it will help heal you. So even if it sounds stupid, I know it does maybe a little bit, but yeah. Okay, yeah. I don't want to ramble too much. I also worry that my camera's going to die. So I'll end it here. And thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. This is feels weirdly enough like one of the most vulnerable things I've ever posted, just because it hurts right now. It is present rather than past, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen. And if there's anything that you want to share, if you have an experience related to this, or there's something heavy on your heart, or just anything that you would want to talk about or share to help you feel better or seen or heard, you just need a reason to talk about it, please always feel free to leave it in the comments. And I always moderate the comments really well, so if anyone's being an asshole, they get deleted right away, so you don't have to worry. No one's going to engage with you in a way that's rude. And I also have an email and a website. It'll be linked down below. But if you want to talk about these things and you want a reason, maybe it more at length than a comment, or you just don't feel comfortable having it in a comment section, you can always send it to me directly through my email, and it can be just between us. And if you have something you want to say and you want others maybe to see it, I can publish it on my website. There's published pieces up there that I would recommend going to read. They'll be linked down below, because people have written really beautiful things, very talented writers. And yeah, if you don't want anyone else to see it, you want to talk about it, you can send it to me anonymously in general, and I'd be honored to read it. So yeah, I make videos on TikTok and Instagram and all that. So okay, I think that's it. I think I'll end it here. And again, thank you for watching this, and for the people who commented on my last video about this topic. People left some really helpful reminders, and I'm very grateful for that, because they helped me to read when I was in the midst of that wet Muppet moment. So thank you for that. And all right, I will see you in the next video, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.